Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Project Dreammaker. I'm your host, Stephen R. Burns, and I'm really excited about the guest I have for you today. And before I introduce her, I just want to remind you, please click like or subscribe. It makes a huge difference for us. Okay, and my guest today is Jackie Chiquette. She is the Executive Vice President of the Ontario Liberal Party. She's also a Vice President at Crestview Strategy and the National Practice Lead. Jackie, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
So this show, we talk about entrepreneurs, artists, and those in the game, and that includes people who work in charity or people who work in politics. It's all very kind of a similar field. And we also talk about starting out and starting over. You are in a unique position, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But tell me a little bit about your childhood, where you grew up, and how things evolved for you from there.
Sure, thanks. So I grew up in a small town just outside of Ottawa. I think the population of my town was 630 people, something like that. And I'm lucky. I count myself blessed that I had the kind of childhood where our parents would kick us out the door in the morning and we wouldn't come back until supper. And it would just be us and our bikes and through the woods and through the fields. And we had a lot of creative fun play. And so I grew up in a house that was really active and engaged. My parents, we had some of the best and most formative discussions of my life around our dinner table when I was a kid. My parents were very aware and had strong opinions about what the government was doing or what was happening around them. And so from an early age, we were taught to think critically, to pay attention to the world around us and to form opinions about what we thought and what that meant. And I think that's probably what paved the early road to where I ultimately ended up today.
So you ended up going to school for political science, right, at Carleton. Was politics already on your mind then when you were a teenager, when you went to school, or how did that evolve?
No, not at all. And if my high school guidance counselor is watching, she will cringe because I really had no plan when I left high school. I chose my degree because I liked the courses that I would have to take as prerequisites. And I enjoyed history, I enjoyed economics, I liked philosophy, I liked politics. So I picked based on that. But growing up in Ottawa or around Ottawa, I genuinely thought that I would graduate university and work for the federal public service. That's what lots of people did. And that's sort of the path that I was on until I did a co-op in university and I worked for 4 months in the federal public service. And I said, that's not for me. They do a lot of great work in the government, but I sort of fell in love with the other side of things kind of accidentally in politics. And I studied politics because I was interested in it, but being involved in politics and getting involved in my first campaign was completely different than anything that I'd ever read about in a book or written papers about in university. And so I think I didn't quite fall in love with politics until I did it, so to speak.
And I'm going to stop there just for a second so people understand, because I think there's a lot of information out there, misnomers, that people think of campaigns and what it is. And now, for those of you listening, Jackie has run multiple successful campaigns, and I know the amount of work that goes into it. But what was the biggest surprise for you, like being on the ground, being involved in a campaign that kind of shook the trees a little bit for you and saying, "Oh, you know what? I really like this."
Yeah, for me, so politics is my sport. I was never particularly athletic growing up. I played sports, but never seriously. And what I love about politics immediately was the camaraderie. There's an intense focus on team and a team that is put through an intense adrenaline-filled short period of time where you need to accomplish a tremendous amount of work to get to the end. And so for me, it was the teamwork and the people that I met along the way that really meant the difference to me. I'm also, notwithstanding that I'm not athletic, I'm hyper competitive. And so for me, politics was fun because it gave me an outlet and it gave me an end goal and things to work towards. And there was a clear there's clear winners and losers. You know when you've made it, and you know when you haven't. And I've been on both sides of that coin.
Yeah, well, I've helped out a couple of campaigns, not obviously to your extent, but I did grow up playing on sport teams and playing sports, and that is absolutely true. And even when you talk to professional athletes, the one thing that the constant that they say is when they retire is they miss the guys in the locker room and the girls in the
Yeah.
locker room. They miss that because you don't kind of get that high end, competitive, we're all pulling at the same string kind of thing from like diverse people from diverse backgrounds, and you have that kind of unifying aspect of it. Um, in terms of challenges, we're going to fast forward a little bit. You moved up the ranks to the point where now you're running campaigns.
Mhm.
Um, what what were the challenges for you, first in general, and then specifically, because this is something I know you're passionate about, we want to do a little deeper dive on this, is your challenges as a woman in politics. Because
Mhm.
there is this misperception, and again, we're going to break this down further in a second. There's a misperception that there's equal representation gender-wise in politics, and that is absolutely not true. It's certainly not true here in Canada. It could be in other countries, but it's not here. So what were the challenges that you found, first of all, in general, and then to being more specific at challenges as a woman?
There's a lot to unpack there. I'll start with indulge me because I'll do a brief rewind to set the stage a little bit.
Okay.
I volunteered on my first election campaign when I was 24, and I signed up not knowing anybody online through a website because I wanted to get involved. It was that simple. And from there, I made connections. I met people. I ended up really liking it. And that resulted in me landing my first job in politics. And that job was working in a constituency office, so a riding office for then Premier of Ontario, Dalton McGuinty. And I was literally writing correspondence. I was answering his mail. That was my job. And I was being paid like $30,000 a year to do it. And I was the happiest I think I've ever been in my life. Just, I couldn't believe that I'd gotten a job in politics. And fast forward 10 years from that day, I did 10 years in government. And when I left, I was a chief of staff for a cabinet minister in two separate portfolios. So I was blessed in that the time that I entered government, I had a runway to be able to grow and to move up the ranks. Not all governments enjoy 14 years in office, right?
Right.
We've certainly seen higher changeover in recent years. So a lot of it in politics is opportunity, timing, and a little bit of luck. But it's also hard work. So two things in particular are disproportionately rewarded in politics above all else, and that is loyalty and hard work. And I say that because, and maybe a podcast for another time, we can all speak to cabinet ministers or appointments in politics that were made for anything other than competency or relevancy, right? And that's because loyalty and hard work are rewarded. And I happen to have both of those as a result of my childhood and as a result of the way I was raised. My dad's a really hard worker, and there was nothing short in our household. So how did I get there? I got there largely because when I look back, I was a kid. Like when I started in politics, I was 24. I didn't have a family. I didn't have a partner. And so for me, it didn't matter if I worked 60 or 80 hours a week. I just did it. I did it because I loved my job and I wanted to be part of it, and I was ambitious. But that is a real barrier. I look to even to my life now, where I am married. I have a young son, and even if I wanted to work 80 hours a week, it's just not feasible anymore. And it's not
Right.
feasible in the same way. I have different priorities. So politics is disproportionately skewed to people who can commit 100% and commit more than what I think lots of people would agree is perhaps maybe even healthy. So that's the honest truth in terms of politics. Um, and then the other barriers really that I faced, politics when I started, and you alluded to this a long time ago, was a different place than it is now even. And we've made some gains, although we're not where we need to be. And there were lots of times in my political career where I would walk in the room and be the only woman.
Right.
The only woman, and often younger than everybody else by 20 years. So if you imagine, right, the anxiety
Wow.
that you feel walking into that room and having some really serious discussions or some difficult discussions, right? Because government and politics is about public policy and making decisions. And so that's the nature of the game. And I think I was able to persevere, one, because of my commitment to my job, and two, I credit my dad and my upbringing and the never give up, never give in sort of mentality that I grew up with really served me well in politics. But what the result of that is, and I think we're getting better at it in terms of parties and government, certainly I've seen it, but for a long time, too long, generations, there was one kind of person excelled and did well at politics. And there was no room for anybody else. And that is why I think you saw it was disproportionately male, it was disproportionately white, it was disproportionately people that came from privileged backgrounds, people who were born into a network, people who knew people who knew people, the powerful families, the powerful circles. And that was who ran our government for generations.
Yeah.
We've started to break down those barriers, but there's way more work that needs to be done.
Well, and I'm gonna give credit here to Jasmine Petty, who wrote a paper, and this is for people listening. This is for federal MPs. So Jackie is the executive vice president of the Ontario Liberal Party. So that's the MPP. So, but since about 1997, the percentage of women representing Canadians as MPs has hovered between about 20 and 25%. That's consistent over the past 25 years. And our current ranking in the world of 193 countries when it comes to gender, proportionate gender representation is 59th. So, Canadians we're really polite about this, but we like to pat ourselves on the back a little bit, quietly, eh? See what I did there? And we just, and we like to think, oh no, we're really inclusive. But the numbers when it comes to women in politics don't bear that out, Jackie. And you touched on something there about the amount of hours that need to be worked because they're that's what's rewarded. Is that the barrier for women about entering politics, is trying to find that work-life balance, or is it also partially it's male dominated and they don't really, men, and I'm obviously a man, don't want to hand over kind of that power, if you will, to women?
Yeah, it's all of those things and more. I mean, the reality is the barriers that prevent more women from not just seeking office, but successfully winning office. Those are two different things. There are tons of barriers, and it's never just one thing. It's a combination of lots of things in unique situations. The hours, so also in part of my role with the Ontario Liberal Party, I've been actively doing a candidate search for the provincial election in 2022. I talk to potential candidates from across the country, lots of different backgrounds. I speak to women regularly, trying to encourage them to run for office. And a couple of key themes keep reoccurring. One is the time commitment and the travel. So particularly women with young families don't want to be away from their families for several days a week. Like, let's not forget that all of those elected officials, whether they sit in Parliament Hill in Ottawa or Queen's Park in Toronto, the vast majority of them have to travel from their home ridings to be at work, quote unquote, when the House is sitting. And so they're away from their family for days or weeks on end. That's tough if you have a young family, and there's lots of mothers that don't want to do that. And the system isn't designed right now to let mothers bring their children or to make it easy for them to be with their families while they're serving. And then there's the what I alluded to before, which was the circles of power and influence, and the fact that politics continues and can still be the darker side of politics is a bit of a closed club. And so women have found it difficult to break through, because to win a nomination and become a candidate in any party, you need to build a team, you need to raise money, you need to win votes, and you need to sign people up. And that can be tough if you don't have a pre-existing network or a large, like, Rolodex, so to speak. Like, that ages me. We don't say Rolodex anymore. All the kids watching are like Googling, what's a Rolodex? But so if you don't have those, that's a problem. And then the third piece, which I mean, is becoming more and more a problem, and I'm very passionate about, is the tone of politics these days. And certainly, one person I think best exemplifies this is Catherine Mckenna. And when you look at Catherine Mckenna and what she went through as Minister of the Environment, being called Climate Barbie, being taunted and harassed on Twitter constantly, I mean, it is unspeakable what some of these politicians go through and endure, the abuse that they get from through social media and from others. And Catherine Mckenna had a police detail who had to go with her everywhere. The police had to take her kids to school. And so when you hear of people going through that to serve, there's a lot of people who say, wait a minute, like, why would I bother? Right?
Yeah, it's not worth it. And just for our listeners, Catherine Mckenna was the federal MP, was a federal MP, correct?
She was federal MP for Ottawa Centre. She served as Minister of the Environment and most recently as Minister of Infrastructure.
Right. Okay. I just wanted to make that clear of her position. And certainly it's a toxic swamp. It's become more toxic. I mean, there are days on my social media, I use it. I'm a writer and a podcaster, so, you know, you sort of obligated to be on it and stuff. But there are days Jackie, I can't be on it. It seems to bring out the worst in us. Mm-hmm. But going back to what you were talking about, that there's this sort of, and I don't want to say that this is all people, but there is an inherent misogyny that seems kind of built into the culture. There was a great book by Rebecca Traister, and this is back in 2008 now, folks. So this is before, this is the beginnings of social media, when it was really become. And there's a book by Rebecca Traister called Big Girls Don't Cry, and it was about Hillary Clinton running. And this is not her running for president. Some people recently remember that. This is her running for the Democratic nomination against Barack Obama. And this was on the supposedly progressive side. And the sort of the abuse and the way that she had to answer questions like, why are you wearing pants? Right? Or questions about her hair. Right? These are not questions that men have to field, right?
No, never.
And like if it was about my hair, like what would I say? I shave my head, right? No, does it look good? I don't know. Do I have any extra bumps? Like, so
yeah,
this true. Is, so, and with that in mind, going through this, and I know you've had a couple of mentors, and we've talked about mentors on this show. What is the best piece of advice that you have received over the years, or best pieces of advice, or just something that's made a difference for you? I know how competitive you are, and you absolutely need that fire to do politics well. So yeah. What's a piece of advice that, or pieces of advice that you received that has helped keep you going?
So I have two. The first is something my father told me when I was very young, and I remind myself almost daily of this. And he said to me, never forget that the world is run by people who show up.
Ooh.
The world is run by people who show up. And it's true. The people who are in the room and around the table at the time of the decision are the ones that get to make the decisions. And why that mattered to me as a kid is, like most teenagers, I was pretty rebellious, and I looked around, and the minute I could realize what was happening in the world, I decided I didn't like the way anybody was doing anything. And the only way I could fix it, my dad's response was always, well, then you do it, right? If you think you can do better, go do better. And so I made that decision early on that if people were making decisions about my life, I wanted to be part of that. So I did. And then the second piece is I was really fortunate early on in my career to have a female mentor who was fantastic and very successful in politics. And she and I would talk about everything. And she's the one that said to me, don't wait to be spoken to. If you sit there waiting for someone to ask your opinion, you'll live your whole life in silence. You need to speak up. You need to assert your role at the table, give your opinions, and be an active part of the conversation. But I remember that often because it's true. And if you watch the dynamic in a room, It's not often that a man will look at a woman and say, what do you think? You have to speak up. You have to let your voice be heard. So those are two pieces.
That they're both excellent. And I mean, sort of leads into my next question. What would you say? And you've had these conversations to any of anybody listening to this show. I know I interact with a number of really smart, informed, and educated women on social media. What would you say if to someone, and particularly a woman who wants to get into politics, to encourage them to do so? Even we've talked about like the toxic environment. We've talked about some of the things that people have to go through, or women have to go through more than a man does. I think that's pretty clear. I don't think that's an outlandish take, obviously. What would you say to them?
So I say a couple of things. The first thing I say to them is that no problem is insurmountable, and some of the barriers that you face they're all manageable with the right team and the right plan in place. So if you take the time and ensure you have this support system and a plan of action, that you can overcome any of those barriers. But I think the more important message that I say to women all the time is things will never change until more women are elected. And so the irony is that the resolution to the challenges that we face in the system is by flooding it with more women, because we know that when we have more women in positions of leadership, they make different decisions and we have different outcomes. And so things won't change until more women are part of the discussion. And if you won't do it, then who will, right? So I think it's a little bit of we need to speak up and take our place. I'll further say that you mentioned the numbers of elected women who have been stagnant, right? It's one thing to get elected, and certainly I commend the Prime Minister for being the first in our history to have a gender balanced cabinet.
Right.
But let's not also forget that just having women elected or at the table isn't good enough. We need women in positions of leadership and significant leadership. So it wasn't until 2020, less than a year ago, that Canada had its first ever female Minister of Finance. 2020, folks. In 2020 or 2021, we shouldn't have the first female anything. We should have been there. We should have done all of those things. And so, but we won't get to that place until there are more women in the process. And so the simple truth is that, and it's something that we all have to take responsibility for and work towards.
That's crazy. I didn't even know that stat. But if you're right, because there is a hierarchy, generally speaking, before you get elected as a leader of a party, you need to be a minister, right? Like you have to move up the ranks. So if women get elected, but then they're just on the backbench, and they don't move up, well, right? And I mean, the one stat is, I mean, you can count Kim Campbell if you want. I think she was prime minister for a couple of days or whatever it was. But we've never elected a female prime minister.
No, that's true.
Right. And the thing that's crazy to me is that you've seen the discussions where these countries that we call them backwater countries, well, they've had female presidents and prime ministers. So like that to me it always sort of, I find it startling, because I like to think of Canada, as, this, aside from the, the beer drinking and hockey, as a really open and progressive place, and trying to get there, but the numbers don't necessarily back it up. So anyway, listen, thanks so much for coming on the show, Jackie. Really loved having you. Maybe we'll have you again next season if you're willing, and we can talk about, well, whatever you want to talk about. This is is there anything else you wanted to say before we head out?
No, listen, I mean, shameless plug. I don't know when you will air this, but this is being recorded so everybody knows on the eve of what is a federal election. And so I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but I encourage everybody to get out there and vote, cast your ballot. It's the only thing your government asks of you. Well, that and pay your taxes, but go cast your ballot and make sure that your voice is heard. So
yeah, and this is going to be out on Monday or Tuesday. I would tell you what day it is, but I seem to have lost track. I only know it's Friday. So this will be out
so it'll be
soon.
I think day one of the RIP period. It looks
There,
like.
there you go. There you go.
Perfect.
So, all right, guys, listen, again, like or subscribe. And Jackie, the information, is there any website that you want to direct people to, or I can include your information if you're watching this on YouTube, but is there a particular website in case someone's listening to this podcast in their car or whatever, where you would like people to take a look?
No, listen, if people are looking to find me and they want to connect, just search me on LinkedIn. That's usually the easiest thing to do, and always happy to chat about politics, or if there's any potential aspiring politicians listening, I'm happy to chat with you about that too.
Take it from me, folks. She's amazing. All right, guys. Thanks again for joining me. My name is Stephen R. Burns. Thank you to Jackie Chiquette for coming in, and we'll see you guys soon. Take care.